This is Leadership Beyond, your community of conversation.
Joining us today is Bryan Sykes. Bryan is an entrepreneur, a speaker, and a mentor with a penchant for maximizing human potential for positive change. As a former fellow and future physicians program at New York College of Osteopathic Medicine, Bryan is passionate about holistic living and helping people to become healthier in every aspect of life. Bryan is the author of the forthcoming book, Retooling and Refueling for Success, the human optimization guide for creating work worth doing and a life worth living. Bryan is an architect of change, and he believes his greatest superpower lies in transforming organizations by converging the best of cutting-edge behavioral science and emerging technology to elevate levels of engagement and positive change for all stakeholders within the organization. Bryan has led retooling and refueling workshops for professionals and veterans for 13 years, which was recognized and awarded by the Department of Labor. His current projects to help move humanity forward include 2 upcoming contributor author books, Nanotechnology, Nanomedicine, and AI Toward the Dream of Global Healthcare Equivalency, that's a tongue tire, and Molecular Manufacturing. Welcome, Bryan Sykes.
I could highlight so many points of our conversations with Bryan today. I'm going to pick one, and that is that Bryan works with premier athletes and brings both his medical background and a psychology background and pulls from the way that athletes prepare and perform. And he relates that to what we all could be doing in our lives, in our businesses, in our professions, and learn from those sports athletes in the way that they both prepare for their performance and how they recover from those performances, and all the while learning through that experience.
What strikes me about Bryan is, with his wealth of scientific knowledge, his approach is always human, and it's always appreciative inquiry. He asks, how is that working? And challenges us to get new practices, and then brings the science in, rather than overwhelming us with his knowledge of science, which is vast, to say, how can we meet this challenge with a new, curious lens and have a holistic, systematic solution? Welcome, Bryan Sykes. Good afternoon, Bryan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to speak with you both here.
Hi, Bryan. Great to have you with us. So that we have some grounding with your background, tell us the story of your journey to the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, it's a few pivotal things that brought me to this discovery that on the topic of energy and how human beings uh, metabolize energy. And one is, in my medical school program as a foreign immigrant physician, I immigrated to the United States for fellowship, and it was called a foreign immigrant physician program, foreign trained physicians. And unfortunately, depending on their training, they go back to school over again. So that's a lot of energy. So when I first came to the United States, I met with Dr. Jim Lear, who actually wrote the book, Powerful Engagement, and the subtitle, Why Managing Your Energy, Not Time, is the Key for Success and Fulfillment. Now, Dr. Jim Lear ran the Human Performance Institute before they were actually bought out by Johnson & Johnson. Human Performance Institute in Orlando teaches professional athletes how to manage mental, physical, emotional, and he called it spiritual energy. So I was fascinated by that because I was always athletes of my family. I was a preemie baby. And so stepping back, I had to learn how to manage my body and my energy. So I was always a young, sickly kid and always had these developmental issues. So my mother put me in martial arts, and that was my mind body connection experience. And so I was just fascinated with this. So when I met Dr. Jim Lear, I said, there are a lot of professionals. I remember in medical school, they'll tell you to take care of yourself. But we're like, what does that mean when we're drinking information from a fire hydrant?
Yeah.
What what does that mean? Like, what does that even look like?
How?
How do we,
Right.
yeah, right. How do we do this? And no one had the answer. So I explained to him there are a lot of professionals. I call them highly leveraged professionals who need to understand how to manage these because my studies in medical school was on the neurobiological origins of human behavior. So we're talking about the biology, these systems that we have that we're so disconnected from. And so we went and University of Florida and the College of Central Florida created a corporate athlete program teaching these highly leveraged professionals how to manage mental, physical, emotional, and we call it social energy. Spiritual and corporate context, they say that's woo woo. So
Mhm.
we called it social energy. And what we were looking at was bringing to the table sports medicine research, right? So you have a daughter who's an athlete, so we know
Yeah.
athletes do prehabilitation. These are things they do before the game. And
Mhm.
then they have rehabilitation, things they do after the games in terms of recovery. They need both in order to perform the game well. And so this is where retooling and refueling came from. It was a 13-year journey in terms of a workshop and a group peer-to-peer group facilitation. And I remember asking these professionals, so tell me what you do before work. How do you prepare? You're a professional, right? You go into the marketplace and you're a professional applying your talent, your gifts, your ability. And I said, yeah, I drink 4 cups of leaded coffee. And I said, okay, I'm not quite familiar with what that term means. Yeah, it
Retool.
has to be black. There it is.
Had
So,
to do that. I'm
yeah.
refueling there.
Yeah, but they both of them needed more than 1 cup, however,
Oh,
to be fueled to get started. That was a fascinating thing for me because now I know they have a reliance on caffeine,
yeah.
right? And that jump starts their day. And so then we talk about how they're managing what's called ultradian rhythm. These are waking hours. Like, okay, how are you managing that get through your day? Then we talk about their health and kinds of symptoms, different things they're experiencing. And then I get to the question of, okay, so now your day's over. What's your recovery strategy? And people say, what the hell is that? Oh, how do you recover from the stress of the day? Oh man, I don't want to think. I don't want to do anything. I need to binge on Netflix and YouTube and all these reality shows. So I've done this
Which is
enough,
stimulating in the brain, right? Not
right?
winding you down. Yeah.
It's stimulating and it's not winding you down. Plus, you didn't learn from anything. And so now you
Mm.
set yourself up to recycle, right? Because the idea of all of life, when we talk about bios, is about advancement. So it's just
Hmm.
like any other system. We want to advance. We don't want to stay where we are. So both of you are in the change management perspective, right? And when I typically ask the question, how many of you, think by nature that we're resistant to change? A lot of people will raise their hand and I say, well, that can't necessarily be true. I never get into your answer is right or wrong, but I think we're primed for change. What I think people are resistant to is how we experience change.
The changing. Yeah.
Right,
The
right.
process you
Because
have to go through. Mhm.
absolutely, because if you know you have support, people don't mind changing.
Mhm.
And so this idea of retooling and refueling, the professionals today in the workplace, and I just completed like 62 interviews because I plan on writing the book, Retooling and Refueling. And I said, the way that people are working today, 4 letter word, it seems as if they're kind of like analogous to an athlete who's already worn him or herself out before the game is even played. And you do that for
Yeah.
10, 20 years and on and on. I say, well, there's a problem with that. The World Health now has sanctioned burnout literally, if you go to their website, as an occupational phenomenon with the ICD code, which means you now can go to the doctor to be treated along with stress for burnout. We had burnout before the pandemic,
Mm.
right? So I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is out of control. We really need to begin to understand that everything that the human body does has an energy expenditure and consequence. And if we can just start with that simple analysis, then we have to look at inputs, we must look at outputs, we must consider our operational efficiency and management, our operational cadence. And not many people are genuinely interested in that. I think we are in such a time where we have an obsession with productivity, an
Mhm.
obsession with it. Let's do things more efficient. Let's get it, check it off my list and these kinds of things. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But how about looking at what is it that are you actually focusing on the right things to begin with? How about starting there?
Mhm.
Instead of just checking it off of your list, what did you learn from that experience so that the next time you encounter a similar or like event, you can be more efficient because now you're getting into mastery. So these kinds of things just go underneath the radar of awareness, and it's fascinating to watch it. But I think we're getting into a crisis when I see Gallup's State of Work reports every year. I think is now at 80% of the American workforce in particular is dissatisfied and disengaged. Well, engagement always starts on a personal level. So I think we have a workforce in various sectors of people who are disconnected from themselves. So there's an opportunity to wake people up. So I'm fascinated with that because of my background, but also I have this grand vision in my mind of when people say, well, what is your vision now that you're in the so-called afternoon of life and you're over 50? And I talk about this idea of sickness as an option. We have all this technology. Everyone and their grandmother wears wearables, but people still aren't living healthier. Chronic conditions are off the charts.
Mm.
Even in my native South Africa, diabetes, which is a lifestyle non-communicable disease, is the second leading cause of death for citizens under 60.
Mm.
I'll be 55 next month. So that's a staggering to me. But again, when I look at what's underneath the research, well, it's something called urbanization. So South Africa and Nigeria, there's few countries on the continent of Africa that are atypical in that they have a growing middle class. And so now you have these lifestyle changes where you're doing Uber Eats in South Africa, right? You're doing all these kinds of different lifestyle changes that you weren't used to. And so with this lifestyle change comes unintended consequences because you're not longer paying attention to metabolic health. Diabetes, obesities, these kind of non-communicable things, they're metabolic in nature, which means this go back to energy. So this is what fascinates me about that, because then we have to be concerned with lifestyle kinds of conditions like food. Food is energy source for the body, right? Food is a chemical reaction in the body. We have to be concerned about sleep. Sleep is circadian rhythms, that's 24-hour cycles. We have to be concerned about waking hours, which is ultradian rhythms. These are 12-hour cycles. So how we manage that energy sets up circadian rhythms. See, again, these things go over underneath the radar of awareness for most people. And these are simple things. They're not things that are hard to do, but they do require intention. They do require practice. And that's what I mean by operational cadence, operational management. So I'm
Oh,
quite fascinated with that because I think the impact overall is we can improve not only the health of the citizenry, but we can improve healthcare systems by not overburdening them. That's why I say sickness essentially can be optional. We don't
yeah.
have to get sick.
A
The
focus
first,
on wellness
yeah,
first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
the first thing that comes to mind in getting people's attention before you can get them the information and the practice is most executives are aware of the cost of lack of engagement. And most of their strategies to deal with that are very surface level, doing
Absolutely.
things to re-engage them rather than understanding. And if you combine it with the great resignation and the things we've been facing with hybrid work, there needs to be a more holistic approach, just as you notice in medicine, it needs to happen, not just deal with the symptoms, not just bring a foosball table in there or something. And it is to understand that human beings that aren't well aren't going to produce good outcomes over time. Just sticking to the
Absolutely.
business case, it's ultimately a human case, but the business case is you're not getting your best because people don't get paid by the hour, they get paid by the value they bring. So
And
now
yeah,
for the next question, I would like you to imagine you're dealing with a CEO who has recognized a problem with retention and with satisfaction, employee satisfaction, and engagement. How could you make a case for understanding, call it the social energy? I have no problem with calling it the spiritual energy, but they call it the social energy, the combination, knowing the reality of our ADD culture. This is a long-winded question, so it wouldn't be this long-winded.
We
But I'm
expect
setting
nothing
it
else
up
from you, Tom.
because, well, thank you. I appreciate it. I resemble that remark, Adrian.
I'll bottom line it, Brian, when he gets there.
I
I'm going to
love it.
bottom line it right now because I think that many people will understand this, but somehow not apply it to themselves or their company.
Yeah, but think about that. If the brain's first order of business is all about preserving and conserving energy, right? So those things that are most closest to you are going to get your attention. Those things that are synaptically strong are going to get your attention, whether you want it to or not. This is why you can hear someone say something sounds meaningful, but behavior in terms of their operation will show you what they're mentally and emotionally identified with. That's the operation. So they may say, yeah, come and fix my people. I'm much like Adrian, where I get to the bottom line because I'm frustrated with a lot of healthcare systems, not just in the U.S. And I have to be careful so I don't get deported. But you hear these wonderful labels. Both Adrian and yourself focus on people first, right? So in healthcare, we talk about patient centered, talk about moving towards value based care. The problem with that is, or the challenge, to say it nicely, is you haven't talked to the people whom it's going to impact. So you haven't talked to patients,
Hmm.
right? So whose value is it?
Hmm.
And the same thing goes for organizations. So they'll say, yeah, well, there's a lack of engagement. Okay, well, if we reverse engineer where engagement always starts on a personal level. So if I don't feel safe, secure, happy, and healthy in your environment, why would you expect for engagement from me? That's just a simple question, right? To think about. I ask this question when I speak to organizations. Tell me about how do you feel about your home? You spent time searching for different neighborhoods, you spent time searching for a certain environment, which plays a key role in behavior. So tell me about how you feel at home. Oh, yeah, home is the kind of place where you put your feet up and you can lay back in your chair. You can do. I said, why don't people feel that at work? I always say talent needs a home. Talent needs a home. It needs to feel safe, secure, happy, and healthy. That's ground zero, number one, because that's the foundation by which you build on. But then also, if you like going to a physician, we work with baselines. Do you understand what the baseline is of that talent? How can you hold someone accountable, let alone responsible for developing and you don't understand what their baseline is. And that, because when you can do that, you can now provide them with the resources, the tools for that development in exchange of that talent within your environment. And now you can hold them accountable. So it's kind of like that was one of the first businesses after I started my first business in medical school and built this prevention as a service model. Because again, I said we have all this information, but people don't know what to do with the information. But the second business I went into was designing HR software. So I met these guys and it was like, hey, you're trained in this neuroscience, neurobiology stuff. We're trying to design some HR software where you help us and be part of our team. I said, sure. And what we looked at was very interesting because what we saw was less than 4% of organizations even know how to model for performance and engagement.
Hmm.
You can model 3, 5 years out projections in terms of financials and those kinds, and tie it back to organizational vision and mission. But when we ask, well, okay, well, what does a high performing team look like for you? Crickets.
So
No one knew anything.
you
Wow.
just put your finger on it. When people hear about the importance of wellness, they agree and they nod their
Mm-hmm.
head, and they're not being insincere. And what you just described is what we call appreciative inquiry. You start being curious about where these things live and what creates them before you come up with some program. You call Adrian and say, we need a change initiative. Well, yes, we do. And let's back up a little. What's really going on?
Yeah.
And uh, patient-centered, you hear in every hospital system, and we hear people-centered in every organizational system. People matter, our people are our greatest asset, but there's a disconnect between what's really happening on the ground and what they mean by that.
And here's what you can ask them, because I often ask organizations this when I hear, I say, okay, where's the evidence? We're always talking about evidence-based this, evidence-based that.
Yeah.
How much
How do you
evidence do
know?
you need? Right. How much evidence do you need to see that what
Mm-hmm.
you're doing isn't it? Whatever the it needs to
Mm-hmm.
be. Your results show that people are frustrated. Your results show that people are leaving. I seen a quote yesterday that said, people don't have business problems; they have life problems that show up in business.
Mm.
And I think it's the same conception, right? A business is a collective of people,
Of
and
lives.
again, of lives, and
Yeah.
we just go
Lives
back to
and relationships.
and
Mm-hmm.
relationships, and we go back to neurobiology 101.
Mm-hmm.
Environment plays a key role in behavior. When I unfortunately lost my wife and daughter in a car accident, but
Mm.
after subsequent to that, I started working with foster care kids. Right, they come from neglect, abandonment, or abuse. Some one, but many of them all three. And what I noted was it didn't matter how much I would hug them and say I love you. One of them literally looked me in the eye and said, your words don't mean anything to me because the same people that said that to me are the same people that put me in this system. That he was only 9 years old. By the time he reached me, he'd already, as they call it in the system, blown like
Hmm.
14 foster care homes that he couldn't get on with the foster parents. And so I noted that, okay, I have to be careful not only with what I say, how I respond to them behaviorally. So when they're breaking plates and fighting in my home, I know they're looking at me to see how I'm going to respond to that. I knew intuitively they're not going to look me in the eye and tell me about their crisis. So I had to get creative. And I said, okay, guys, in Florida and mid Florida, where I am in the Ocala area, um, I'm not far from either coast. So I'm like an hour from Daytona Beach. So I said, okay, guys, get in the car. We're going to go for a ride. Where we're going? Oh, we're just going to drive. I just sit and listen in the back and get all the information I want. I just facilitate some prompt that will get everyone talking, and all they know is we're driving to this special place, and that creates an environment for engagement, right?
Mm.
It creates the environment for engagement. And so when I look at those who are successful, if you look at like teal organizations and these kinds of things, the Chinese model, the Rendan Hiyai model, they said we're not trying to be the captain of the ship. We're trying to be an architect. We want to create the space for people to be the
Mhm.
best version of themselves. And you can do that in a hierarchical fashion. You can do it in any model, but you have to be able to understand people, or at least want to understand people. And this is where technology can help, because now you can use feedback. If you notice, Adrian, you have a daughter that's in athletics, right? So if you notice now, that's all I watch on TV is sports. So if you notice now, the athletes have a tablet, and when they call a timeout, they get on the sideline and they can look at themselves and where they're playing out. And now they
Yep.
can strategize and go back into the game and course correct.
Mhm.
How many organizations have that? You have annual reviews after, way
Mhm.
after the fact, right? So what
Yep.
we were looking at when we built dashboards for companies, give them feedback straight away.
Right.
Have them
Quick.
sign off on what accountabilities and responsibilities they think they bring to the table.
Mhm.
This is engagement design. This is what we've seen there's a lack of in just about every sector, every organization all over. And that gives you evidence,
And
because now you
evidence
can
in the
see
time to
what
do
worked.
something. You're doing
Absolutely.
in time to course correct, right? Just like that
Absolutely.
sports, you're watching yourself during the game. You go back into the game, play differently, right? Or change your mind about something, reframe it, whatever.
It starts
Mhm.
with awareness and then it
Absolutely.
moves to intention. And then it starts moving towards solution. And there's just this drive. We have a problem with engagement. Let's solve it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
evidence is always what isn't happening. So they get evidence. They say, yeah, we only have this percentage of engagement and our productivity is down. We got to do something. But there's
Yeah.
no awareness that a solution isn't going to come into this current environment
Right.
and
And
produce.
Adrian asked a pivotal question at the beginning of this. Okay, so once you decide you have a issue, or an issue, a problem, how? How are you going to do it? The how should help you reverse engineer, because now you have to look at what are our resources, how resourceful are we, what are the identified issues, because oftentimes the conflict isn't the conflict. The conflict is something underneath. That's the
Right.
iceberg, right? So the
Mhm.
mass is underneath. So you have to go a little bit deeper.
Mhm.
And again, what we hear a lot is people, oh, I don't have time for that. Oh, but you unconsciously have time for drama?
Because
Yeah.
that's what you're gonna get, right? Yeah. If we
It
don't
would be
spend
like
time
the
on this,
medical
we'll just
world.
keep going.
Just prescribe a
Exactly.
drug. We have a symptom, provide a
Yeah.
drug
Yeah.
rather than
When we
teach people
fix
how
Exactly.
it,
to
we cause
focus,
another
give them Adderall,
problem, fix
whatever.
that problem, cause another problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge of our time is, I think, and I'm not blaming technology because I'm certainly around it enough as an advisor to health tech startups, but I think we have a problem with understanding the things that are worth working for certainly require some time. And that certainly is in the category of relationships. So when I'm talking about operational cadence and management, what I'm talking about is this idea of what are the intersectionalities of knowledge management, task management, and relationship management? How do they come together so that there's a consistency of flow and not a one-off
Mhm.
thing? And that's why it's a genuine design issue that's not necessarily about, is it human centered? I think we take that to the next level and say, is it humanity centered? And I give you an analogy of what I mean by humanity centered versus human centered. Human centered, we're looking at things regionally. So I can say what's in the best interest in terms of the healthcare system for the United States. When I'm saying humanity centered, I'm saying what's the best thing for the planet?
Yeah.
What's the best thing for all of us? Right? Because right now, again, I was a preemie baby, so as a lifelong vegetarian, I look at plant-based products, and I'm concerned about some of the products in there. Like, okay, your body's not meant to digest that. It's going to have an impact over time. So here it is. It's a plant-based product, good for you. That's human-centered. Planetary, humanity-centered perspective should have said, well, I need to be concerned with these ingredients that's going in it now and how it's going to impact in the long term. And I look at that because oftentimes when you talk about value driven or value-genic kind of mindset, people don't understand value isn't the end product exclusively. You should be concerned about the potential creating value along the continuum. That changes the game right there because you're not just so interested in that short-term outcome. You're interested in a short-term outcome in the context of long-term perspective. And
Valuing.
that take evaluating exactly. And there's a distinction in that aspect of thinking about things. And so you can't rush into it. You want to set up short-term experiments, get information, see what's working, what isn't working, what's providing the evidence of why things isn't working. You don't guess, you assess. So you take your time and you keep assessing. That's what moves people along this continuum to resolve the VUCA world, where there's the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity.
Bryan, can you address on the individual level? So the goal is to change humanity, but starting with ourselves. And imagine that you're in burnout. Where can you begin to gain a little bit more space and understand your own rhythm so you don't just keep going off the cliff at the
Yeah,
end
and
of
that's a great question because that's an agility issue also when you talk about self-care. And you said the key word, you want to create space
Hmm.
between you and how you're interacting with life, because that observation allows you to look in and be an observer as opposed to an unwilling participant. Because when you're an unwilling participant, that's what we call exteroceptive. So these are external things that are guiding you instead of being internally led, which is where the
Hmm.
intrinsic reward come from.
So that would
A-
sound like if this company would only change, I would be well. And that's not where you got to start. You got to say, okay, how can I be as well as possible until the external changes?
Right. It's so it's interesting because I was just having this conversation with my young nephew. I have six sisters, three brothers. So I have 26 nieces and nephews, and so
Mhm.
they get when a West Indian or an African say, walk with me, that means you're going to get a lecture and you're probably in trouble. So I said, come walk with me because he's having issues in his work. And he's like, Unc, I'm not getting any satisfaction from my job or from my work. And I'm listening to, the whole pointing a finger, the problems out here kind of thing. And I simply
Mhm.
said to him, and I didn't plan it, because most of the time I don't plan anything I'm saying, it's kind of flowing. But I said, it sounds to me like there's a misunderstanding. He said, what is that? Well, the misunderstanding is number one, if we break down the words satisfaction, I gave him the Latin roots for satis, which means enough, and facati, which means making, enough making. So I said to him, satisfaction doesn't come from the work. Satisfaction is the what you bring to the work. So now, who's at fault here if you're not getting satisfaction? And he got very quiet because he didn't want to say, well, it's me. Because we can't say the organization, just like we can't say for definitively that burnout, the organization is the cause, right? Because if one
Mhm.
person burns out, the next person doesn't, that can't necessarily, a cause by definition means same thing's going to happen to the same people all the time.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
so in other words, when I talked about baseline earlier, we all have different thresholds. We all have different mental, emotional, physical thresholds. This is where self-care comes in and creating that space so you understand what those thresholds are. So then, even if you're in an environment where it's taxing for you, because you could be like myself. You could be a highly sensitive person, which means that sensory processing sensitivity is a real thing. Like when I go to games, as much as I love sports, the smell of peanuts in the baseball game and the crowd, the smell of beer, that's very sensory rich for me. So I can only take it for a certain amount of time. So I literally have to get up and walk
Mm.
outside and then come back. So knowing that in an environment where, I grew up in a household with six sisters, three brothers, right? Everyone is talking, there's lots of noise. So I have to excuse myself.
Mhm.
So understanding these are
Mm.
the things that lead my self-care, that guide my self-care, and individuals need to understand the same thing. So even if they're in an environment where it's taxing for them, you have to double up and be responsible for doubling up on your recovery strategy. That's your responsibility. It's not the
So the
organization's.
word really is responsibility, and literally choose a new response, even if it's a small difference from the current. Because if the problem is out there, you have to wait for it to change before you get better.
Yeah, I use two words and I break them up to in a hyphen way. So I know it's not spelled that way, but I spell account and ability, and then response and ability. Both
Mm.
are presuming you have an ability. So we take account for what is now, for what's showing up in my environment, what's showing up in my mental Rolodex now. I'm taking account for what is, but I'm responding for what could be.
Love that.
Yes. And that takes to me, when I hear that, I hear that takes space. That takes for me, it would take quiet. I know it wouldn't take quiet for everybody. Maybe they like some kind of noise, right? But for me, that would be quiet, not interrupted, time to take that assessment, to really
Absolutely.
think about that. Hmm.
Absolutely. Dr. Susan David is a fellow South African. She has a book called Emotional Agility, and she offers like four key things in terms of what it takes to kind of create that space. Like that's what her research and studies on. And that becomes very important. And again, I think the more technology come out, the more we have to do that. My mom coined our era as a microwave mentality. Like we can Google and push a
Yeah.
button and just be done with it. And the assumption is that I'm done, it's done. But then you have to wonder, well, why is this thing keep repeating itself? So
Hmm.
the key is because I didn't learn from it, right? So what we have a challenge with, I think, is the difference between what I call content and context shaping. Content, we can consume information. We have it everywhere. We don't live in a time where we have a dearth of information. But context and applying it to a context is where it's like there's a gap there. Now we don't exactly know where it fits. That is VUCA, right? There's some uncertainty, ambiguity, and as long as we can say, okay, yeah, I'll leave that for later time, then we're already set ourselves up to recycle the same pan.
We
So
don't
we
connect
have
the dots.
exactly, and
We get all
that's
these
our
dots, but
responsibility.
how do we connect them?
And that is our
Hmm.
responsibility. It's the main responsibility is connecting the dots.
Hmm.
After every engagement, and this is my daily practice, because I say it takes intention to move intention to execution. It takes the awareness. My practice is always about journaling. It's always reflective in terms of what did I learn? How can I grow? What do I need to develop? That's my practice. So, in martial arts, my Sifu, my master, used to always tell me that there is no there to get to. Because he always say, yeah, you're more interested in getting this black belt, but do you know there's other degrees of black belt once you get that?
Just keeps
So
going.
he's so he said, if you just stop trying to get there and be here. Now again, that sounds so woo-woo, but when I
Yes.
stopped focusing on it, now I had more energy because again, everything the body does has an energy consequence. So if I'm spending more time worrying than actually optimizing performance, I just compromise my own quality to actually perform, to get the thing done. And we go through this all the time. I see people making productivity lists and going through hacks. And then I ask, well, what did you learn? I don't have a to do list, I have a to be list. The to be list goes into the accountability. What do I need to take account for right now? How much energy do I have to this
Mm,
project? How much time do I have? What are the resources that are identified? What are resources I need? So that to be list helps me to shape who I need to be to actually get these things done. Now I
mm,
can respond accordingly and create an operational cadence so I can engage at my level on my own accord. And then I can, level up from there. So it isn't about just reaching and doing the task itself. It's about learning from it and engaging in a way so that you can gain something from that. And then you can apply that to the next thing. And so now I call that actual participating in life as opposed to kind of
What a
letting it fly
novel
by.
concept to actually participate in life rather than check
Right.
it off. We have time,
Exactly.
Adrian, for one more question. Make it a good one.
well, I
Question.
guess I was just going to respond to that it seems that there's it's a mindset I mean, it's a paradigm shift, from and I think, Americans especially, I'll say that, we are so focused on the getting there, the getting it done, the doing it, the prestige of hard work, which equals long hours and, just all of that mentality. And that has been woven into our thread since the beginning of America, at least, right? For Americans. And I did a lot of global work, and so I worked a lot with most of the Europeans, and they're like, we're off for August. Like, what do you mean? You're when in August? Oh, the whole August. What?
Yeah.
With no like feeling bad about that. Like, well, who's gonna do your work? Nobody. It's gonna wait. Like, this is a phenomenon to me. And so I guess that my question, to bottom line it, is how do we, that feels so ingrained to be that way. How do we be a different way? How do we work towards that?
Yeah. I think you have to want to, number one.
Mm,
I've always been fascinated with, I call myself a lifelong learner. So I know for me, a lot of the learning requires to unlearn.
yes.
So for instance, I remember going through a rotation um, and met an Italian guy who, he they call it pre-diabetes, but there really is no such thing. He was just pre-diabetes is what's called a dysmetabolic state. So he was overweight and he's kind of still, we're talking about lifestyle medicine and lifestyle changes. And he says, that's tough for me to do. And I said, why? He says, I'm Italian. I say, oh, okay. So he's like, yeah, Italians like to eat.
We eat a lot of cheese,
Yeah, we eat a lot of cheese. And he
a lot
says,
of
we go
pasta.
through 7-course meals. And I said, okay, great. I don't challenge your Italianness if that's a thing. But but let's ask, let's go through some questions here and analyses. If your being Italian is perhaps setting you up to kill you, would
Mm,
would you be interested in making some changes? And he said, sure. And I said, so maybe you can, it's not that you have to take away something or give up something. You're just repositioning, reorienting yourself to something, other possibilities. The root
mhm,
word for possibilities literally means indicated potential. So if you start there with these small experiments and just see what it takes, and that's what I challenge him to do, just see what it takes to make the same Italian meal, but from like an organic perspective with less carbs or less whatever, and just experiment, see how you feel afterwards, like actually document it, and then come back and let's see what the actual physical results are. So again, the physical, mental, emotional, social. So I set him up for experiment with those so he can just see for himself. Oh, but what I'm getting to is this idea that experience itself can be a great teacher. And it's not an experience that, oh, I have to get it all at once because you never do. There's just some things, just like you can know your way home when you're driving a car, but you can't account for things up the road.
mm,
Even sometimes the GPS can't pick that up, right? And so the
Right.
idea is to be moving forward, and you'll get a lot of creativity, lots of creative kinds of tension aspects in movement, but not thinking about it.
Mm.
So you start there with just creating these small experiences. But for me, as a lifelong learner, I see the path of unlearning to learn all the more. And I set that up all the time when I want to understand something. Because I can learn a lot from the experience itself. And I often ask people to do that. In fact, I was just doing some research, and if I find it, I'll email it to you both. But this idea of why colleges run innovation challenges, and so they were talking about how these innovation challenges, there's, people learn how they can do things differently. They learn they can do things collaboratively and designing their support systems and those kinds of things. And I remember taking a course, very interesting book. Um, Dr. Ekbal, University of North Carolina, wrote a book. If your life were a business, would you invest in it?
It's a good
And in this
question.
course, exactly. And in this
Yeah.
course and in the book, you actually design life businesses.
Mm.
So it's kind of like the wheel of life where you segment your life, and each one of those could be a business. So I had my core health business, I had my relationship business, and then you can create fancy names for them. But the book takes you
Hmm.
through just like running a business. You do an inventory, you do an audit,
Oh.
you solicit strategic partnerships. This is what I call your having a personal operating system. So it's kind of like Apple say there's an app for that. In neuroscience, there's an app for every behavior. So if we understand that there's a strong association, there's a strong pattern, there's a strong process or programming, then that means that my learning, my self learning, I can create my own personal operational system.
Could you repeat that? So app is the
There's a
acronym. Say it again slowly, please, because I
there's
missed
a strong association, there's a strong
association,
yeah, there's a strong pattern,
pattern,
a strong processing,
process. Yeah, got it.
and programming. So that's what we used to joke in the lab all the time, that there is indeed an app for it. All behaviors, there's something underneath it. Because
Yeah.
for one neuron to literally communicate with another neuron, the language is it literally has to fit like a lock and key.
Mm.
So there's no behaviors that's an accident. You might be unaware of it, but again, the strongest synaptic connection, those behaviors are going to see. So again, this is why people can say something sounds interesting, sound pleasing, but then you turn around, it's like, okay, that's a mismatch. Your behavior doesn't match what
Doesn't
you just
match.
said.
If we change the surface and the pattern doesn't shift, then it reconfigures, doesn't it?
Yeah, it reconfigures quite easily. And so
Yeah.
this is why you see a lot of people trying to, and this I guess is the challenge of productivity. They're trying to shift things by changing behavior, but they're not shifting the identity. The behavior is going to follow what you're identified with. That's what starts these synaptic
And so
connections.
it
Just
creates oscillation. You go
absolutely.
on the diet, you lose 5 pounds, then you miss it a day and you come right back. And it's because you haven't really made a fundamental change. You just changed
Yeah.
what you ate
One
for
thing.
3 days.
Yeah, it's kind of like changing the location, right? It's kind of like why we're surprised when one person, does something in one organization, and then they claim to be uh, rehabilitated. They go to another organization, do the same thing. All they did was change locations. They
Yeah.
haven't really shifted the
They
behavior,
fired one boss and they got a new boss across
Mhm.
country that was the same way, or one husband or one. Yeah. We call that
right?
in recovery, we call that geographic cures. And the problem with that is wherever you go, there you are.
Hmm.
Right,
You
exactly.
think if I could just get out of this country or out of this city or out of this family,
Mhm.
there's
And we
nowhere to
hear that a
go.
lot, don't we? We hear that a lot.
Mhm.
We hear people say, "Yeah, I'm going to go to India and I'm gonna
Yeah.
get enlightened. I'm gonna throw my passport in the Ganges and I'm gonna come back a changed person." And I tell them, "You don't have to go anywhere.
Mhm.
You don't. You really don't. you start with changing your identity. And that's where these self-experiments come in. Change your identity, set yourself up so that you can now experiment with behaving differently. The connection, bringing those two together is going to create a strong synaptic connection over time.
Love it.
That
And then it
answers
becomes
the
a new
how.
habit.
Then it becomes a new
Exactly.
habit.
So
Thank you.
metaphorically, the way I set this up is heart, hand, head habits.
Ah,
Work with those 4 dimensions. And if you notice, the head isn't first, right?
Mm.
So the matters of the
and the
heart
hands
are
aren't
things that are in,
first. And the hands
and the
aren't first.
hands aren't first.
Human doings.
So the right. So the matters of the heart are the things that you really value
Yeah.
intuitively. It comes to you. You don't have to ask for it, right? So you use that to put your hands to experiments with something. The head systematizes it. So now you have this operation, and the habits support all 3. So I look at those 4 dimensions whenever I'm creating my self experiments. What's the hand? What's the heart, hand, head, and habits are doing? And that's what I'm surveying all the time through this
Yeah.
idea of what did I learn? How can I grow? What do I need to develop?
And it
Well,
starts with heart. And
Exactly.
if we're focused on humanity, right, then heart should come first. But
Exactly.
it's getting our head around that and kind of
Yeah.
accepting that, I think.
Because think about it from a wisdom perspective, right? The head is going to be biased. The head is going to say, I know this. When it's really, I know of it, but I don't really know it
Mhm.
because we haven't experimented with it yet. And
Mhm.
so, the codex of bias, I don't know if either of you have seen it, but it said like this research, we have at least identified 140 biases or something.
Mm.
So
Mm-mm. I haven't
if
seen it.
you yeah, if you Google the codex of biases, someone researched that and said we have again, these are the ones that are identified
Yeah.
in terms of biases. So we never start with the head. And all
Yeah.
wisdom, spiritual or otherwise, always say, in all that getting, get understanding. So that Stephen Covey, understand
That's
first and
my
then be
man,
understood.
Solomon. Stephen Covey made a lot of money off of both Solomon
Exactly.
and St. Francis of Assisi. He said, seek first to understand, then to be understood. And he copyrighted, so he could
Oh,
sue St. Francis. But
oh, that's good wisdom.
it is great wisdom. Thank you so much for joining us
Oh, this has been wonderful. Thank you for
Likewise,
all the
thank you.
insights.
and
Oh, I
making
love it.
space for this conversation. And you
Oh,
always show up
absolutely.
fully present, and we appreciate that.
Well, thank you both for the opportunity. I hope it's helpful for the listeners and the leaders, and hopefully they actually take action with it.
Yeah.
Yes. That will
Thank
be
you.
our
Yeah,
challenge to them. And we'll support them along the way, right?
Challenging like valuing. It's a continuous
exactly,
process, not an event. And we have a community that's there to support one another, and we can do this thing
exactly,
Yeah. Together.
exactly.
together.
Together,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
exactly,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Beyond podcast. We hope you benefited from this conversation as much as we have. We invite you to join our community of conversation. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to sign up at aleadershipbeyond.com for free materials and updates. That's aleadershipbeyond.com. Join us in 2 weeks for our next episode.